I think I'm going to start now. Just before the introduction, some house rules. The lecture is probably going to be around 45 minutes. And afterwards, if you ask questions to Juan within the chat, I then will ask Juan the questions that are being asked if we have enough time. So this is Sami Di Joseph from the Arabic and Islamic Sciences Museum at the Sheikh Abdullah Salim Center in Kuwait. Welcome to our new lecture, part of the Islamic Art Series. Today we are going to explore a topic that we haven't explored so far in terms of geography. We're going to talk about Iran with Juan de Lara. Juan is the cultural manager at Asia House in London and the elected fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, and also trustee and board member of Global Learning London. He graduated in Madrid from the CICE, the School of Digital Technology, in 2006, and did his MA on History and Architecture of the Middle East in 2018, where he was awarded the Ralph Pinder Wilson Award and researched the Royal Court propaganda in the courts of early Islam. His dissertation is being published as we speak by Brill. Juan is also undertaking his PhD at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, focusing on ritual in ancient Greece associated to light and architecture. Today, Juan will talk to us about the history of the Qajars in Persia during the 19th century, as they thrived as a political regime by adapting their nomadic tent identity to fit the urban setting and sought to legitimize their rule by identifying themselves with the pre-Islamic empire of the Iranians. A very intriguing topic. The floor is yours, Juan, for you to start. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sami. Really appreciate the introduction, and thank you to the Sheikh Abdullah Salim Center also for the invitation. And thank you, everybody, all of you who are here sharing this time with me. That's right. I am going to be talking today about the 19th century Iran, the Qajar dynasty, and how they managed to ensure their place in power by using pre-Islamic cultural elements. But before that, I like in every talk to think of what I want the audience to come out with. And in this case, the first thing I want you to understand is the complex visual richness of Iran, its monumentality and its creativity. But more importantly, I want you to see how a particular phenomenon that occurred 200 years ago had deep consequences in the formation of the modern Iranian identity. And still nowadays, still up to today, it shapes the politics of the world we live in. So to start with, I just want to put here a timeline of the dynasties of Iran. Today we're going to be discussing particularly the Qajar, who took place in the 19th century. I'm going to briefly mention the Afsharid, the Zand, the Safavids, the medieval dynasties, but more importantly, I'm going to be talking about the Achaemenid Empire, the Parthian Empire, and the Sasanian empires, which are all the pre-Islamic dynasties that took place before, obviously, the advent of Islam. I'm also going to be talking about the Pahlavis. This is a late addition after I was preparing the presentation. What these three dynasties, the Achaemenid, the Parthian, and the Sasanian, shared together is that they had a unique characteristic, is that they were Zoroastrians. For all of you who do not know what the Zoroastrianism is, it was one of the first monotheistic religions that appeared around 1200 to 600 BC, propelled by a figure known as Zoroaster, and whose core belief was the dualistic nature of the universe, the eternal battle in between good and evil. And here on the left, you have an image of Persepolis. It's one of the best known touristic attractions of Iran nowadays. It was built by the Achaemenids in the 6th century. And on the right, you have a rock-cut relief of the Sasanians. The Sasanians were a Zoroastrian dynasty who ruled from the 3rd to the 8th century of our era. And in this image, you can see the king Shapur. after the victory of Edessa, which represented one of the worst military disasters in the history of the Roman Empire, because Emperor Valerius was made a captive, and it is said that melted gold was poured down his throat. So we're going to be discussing a lot and addressing the Achaemenids and the Sasanians. But how do we get from them to the Qajar? Well, we have the advent of Islam, and after that, a number of medieval dynasties established themselves in the Iranian plateau. They were tribal, they were feudal, they kept battling for power until a number of nomadic dynasties were able to take power. One of them, in the 16th century, were the splendorous dynasty of the Safavids, who gave Iran a prominent role in the geopolitical scenario of the world at that time. However, in 1722, I believe, the Safavids were overthrown by Afghan invaders, who themselves were expelled by Nadir Shah Afshar around the mid-18th century. He's a very prominent figure in the history of Middle East, particularly the region of Afghanistan and Iran. And despite all of these, there were appeals that invited a new dynasty, the Zand, to take power from the Afshar. The interstice fights in between family members, however, weakened them so much that at some point the tribe of the Qajar were able to take control of the nation, take over Tehran, and establish their capital there. However, who are the Qajar? Well, the Qajar are a tribe of Turkic origin from the region of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and northern, the south of the Caspian Sea, so basically here, where it says Qajars. They unified Iran under one dynasty. They brought unity to a nation that had been in turmoil for over 100 years. And it is often said that the Qajar were a weak dynasty. They lost a lot of territories, and they left the country in a very poor economic situation. However, they brought a stability, and they helped to maintain the nation as one, if not the only one, in the region that remained uncolonized in a time where colonization was at its right. However, the Qajar managed to revamp an image of imperial splendor that was last seen only under the Safavids in the 17th century. And this is precisely the theme of our topic today. How did they manage to transmit this power? Let's now put some faces to our characters today. And I have here 4 of the rulers of the Qajar dynasty from the 19th century. There were a few more, but we're not too interested in them today. We have Agha Muhammad Khan, who was the founder of the dynasty. He was a ruthless warrior. He was very cruel, but very capable. He was a eunuch, so he could not have descendants. That's why he appointed his nephew, Fath Ali Shah, as his successor. Fath Ali Shah had a long reign and was succeeded himself by Muhammad Shah, Muhammad Mirza when he was a prince, and succeeded himself by his son, Nasser ad-Din Shah. Today, we're particularly interested in these 2 figures, Fath Ali Shah and Nasser ad-Din Shah. Why? Because under the rule of these 2 figures is that we see an attempt to look back at historicizing or historic elements of ancient Iran, pre-Islamic Iran, to appear in the symbolism of their court. And today I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Pahlavis. I'm going to touch upon them because this same effect, this same phenomenon continued afterwards. And you see, what happens is that when a new dynasty establishes themselves into power, the first thing they want to do is to legitimize themselves. And what all these rulers here on the screen managed to do is to imbue themselves with enough elements that allow them to represent power. Legitimization is very important to any dynasty around the world, but in Iran, it's particularly important, and it has a very ancient tradition of iconographic depictions. This is usually manifested by means of a word known as far or farra. this word cannot be properly translated into English. It means something like divine right, divine glory, or kingly presence. If we compare it to words from other language etymologically, in Ossetic, the language spoken in the Caucasus Mountains, farna means peace, happiness, abundance. Or in Armenian, park, and I know there is someone in the audience who is Armenian and will correct me on my pronunciation. Park meant glory, honor, and celebrity. Actually, in Uzbekistan, once the region was Sogdian and was under Buddhist control, this word meant a position of the Buddha. And here on screen, it's often said that this circlet hand on the hand of Auramazda represents that far, that divine glory. It's often said that as well it's represented by ribbons or by a tiara, by the crown. These are examples of Sasanian art. Some other cases, it's represented by a pearl necklace in the beak of a mythical bird. So how did the Qajar display their power and their imperial vision? First of all, I'm not ever implying that the Qajar were aware of this concept of far, but they were indirectly aware about the importance of this concept in the nation. It had a continuity that we can see by the way they spoke to us. And the way they spoke to us, and I think the key element of how they translated that power, was their visual vocabulary. In particular, figurative representations of rulers, and the Qajar used it very effectively. For example, this image in the most typical Qajar style is of Fath Ali Shah. It was painted very early on in his rule, and this painting is huge. It's 2 meters 5 height, and the ruler here is represented with his imperial garb. He's wearing the royal tiara called the Kiani or the Kayanian tiara. We'll go back to that in a minute. And he himself is representing himself not as a king, but as an emperor. And you see why? Because this painting was finished around 4 years after this other painting was made in France. The comparisons are obvious, and the message is clear. I am an equal. Going back to what I referred to as the Kayanian crown or the Kayanian tiara, it's an element that is very telling about the idiosyncrasies of the Qajar. Let me show you on the screen on the left. This is a mosaic from the Dome of the Rock where the crown of the Sasanians is represented. The name Kayanian alludes to the dynasty of kings and heroes of the Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, and as well to the dynasties that appear in the Shahnameh, Iran's national epic and mythical spine, I would say. The deeds of these heroic rulers and warriors are often identified as historical characters from the Achaemenid dynasties and the Sasanian dynasties. And I'm just comparing here on the screen the crown of the Sasanians to the one created by the Qajar. The one in the middle is a photograph of late Qajar Shah wearing it, and the one on the right is a replica. The fact that the Shahnameh was an element of a cultural element that the Qajar were looking at, it's evidence because it's a poem that was a collection of poems and narrations that were collected during the Ghaznavid rule, written by Ferdowsi in the 11th century. And it was very important for a Zoroastrian tradition, as it traces the links between the beginnings of the religion to the last Sasanian emperor. During the Safavid times and before, it had certain relevance. In fact, the Safavids created a state agency that supervised the storytelling of different storytellers that were moving from cafe to cafe, because they knew the power that these tales had to manipulate their audience. During the Qajar and the Pahlavis, storytelling continued to be a popular activity. And in terms of painting, this is evidence in painting because as early as during the late Zand dynasty, we see painters attempting to represent these historical pseudo-mythical characters in art. And this continues throughout the Qajar tradition, as we see on the images on the right. Qajar style is also very telling. On screen, if you're not that familiar with it, you can see what is, I would say, one of the most characteristic paintings from this dynasty. Pay attention to the frontality of the images, to their colors, to the position, to their arms, to their faces. I think there is something about it that needs to be said, which is how it breaks with the painting tradition from the previous dynasties. On the left of your screen, of this slider, you have what would be a characteristic Safavid painting. There is an attempt for realism and naturalism. If you pay attention to their faces, you see their shadows, their shapes, their body contour. And if you see on the ground, the shadows that they are casted by the figures, when compared to Qajar art on the right of the screen, the differences are evident. The Qajar art almost represents or articulates the members of these figures in a funny way. However, this, in history of art, has a name and has a very long-standing tradition. In history of art, the capacity to represent bodies in a non-naturalistic way is called sometimes as hieratism. It comes from the Greek word hieros, sacred. And it's a strategy, a visual strategy used throughout centuries, throughout all over the world. Greeks used it, particularly during the archaic period. Egyptians used it, and Christian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox used them in their icons. What hieratism or hieratic styles implies is that they brought rigidity to the body, and that gave them solemnity. And that solemnity transmitted an aura of sacredness, which the Qajar were using. But the Qajar were not the only ruling family that used this strategy. If for some of us, a closer image, for example, would be Queen Elizabeth I. On the screen, you can see a painting where if you measure the size of her shoulders or the length of her bust, it's not realistic. It's an attempt to elevate Elizabeth as a divine being. She has her feet set on the map of England, and she's standing in between day and night. The Qajars managed to use this hieratic style in, I would say, in a very well accomplished way. It's shocking, and I think it had a very psychological effect in the audiences. If we compare, this is a mural painting, a massive mural painting in the Negaristan Palace in Tehran. If we compare it with the previous Safavid style, the differences are obvious. Let's compare it, for example, with this image, the Saf Salam, a saluting line from the celebration of Nowruz, of New Year's, where Fath Ali Shah is represented with his court, probably his sons. It's said that he had 50 sons and I think 40-something daughters. Clearly, he did not waste his time. And what's important here is what mural painting is transmitting to the audience. And I want to quote Leila Diba, who defined Qajar mural painting in the following way. It's characterized by frontality and flatness, compositional organization in registers. You can see that here on the sides of the mural where the princes are located, legibility from a distance, monumentality, and isolation of figures from one another. And why the Qajar used mural paintings in such a way? Well, as I said, because of the psychological imprint that it had, but also because mural painting, it's indigenous from the region. As far, if we go back to the 7th century, the dynasties or the ethnic groups of the Sogdians were already painting their palaces with murals of this style. If you see the figure here on the top of the front wall, you can see a seated ruler, which reminds us, or to the image of Fatalisha that we have seen before. It's an echo of this representation. It's static, it's establishing registers. Here you can see a piece from Penjikent, which is not far away from the reconstructed scene I just showed you, where also you can please pay attention to the hand on the right of your screen, which is passing a tiara with a ribbon to this seated figure. It's by no means a ruler, but it's a way of giving prominence to this figure, almost like a halo in Christian art. During the Ghaznavid rulership and during Islamic times, figurative representations and mural painting continued. This is in some palaces, and particularly in the Shahnameh, as it was gathered and compiled during this time, several descriptions of mural paintings appear. And sometimes when we think of the Iranian world, we forget that, for example, in the 12th century, the Iranian world expanded up to regions like Tibet, where the Ghurids established themselves, and they adopted some of the local administrations and traditions, including the religion of Buddhism. However, scenes like these ones of a seated local governor or ruler are rare and are completely out of place in temple painting from Tibet. This is clearly an echo of the Iranian tradition, where hunting and cup rides and feasts are more often represented. I just want to contrast these two images. On the left of Fatalisha, which we now know how to identify with his long beard, and the one on the right, which is from Penjikent. This is again an 8th century mural painting from Sofia. I think there is no need for me to highlight the similarities, and Fatalisha was not acquainted with this particular painting, because this was excavated, I think, in 1925, but correct me if I'm wrong. So he was long dead after when this was unearthed. However, what I think here happened is that this awareness was indirect. As I said before, the tradition of the Ghaznavids left very much documentation of mural representations and depictions. So we now know that mural representations and paintings were effective ways to transmit this idea of continuity. Another thing that Fatalisha, looking back at the history of Iran, did was to adopt a technique that had been abandoned for over 1,000 years, and this is that of rock relief carvings. This was a direct response to a Sasanian tradition of expression of power. The Sasanians used these rock-cut carvings, and by the way, these are huge. These are about 5 meters tall, if I'm correct. And these were meant to glorify and trumpet the rulership outside the walls of the court for travelers and bypassers. It was abandoned with the advent of Islam, but for some reason Fatalisha decided to retrieve it. And here, I'm sorry for the picture, it's not the best one, it's the best one actually I could find, but you can more or less see the figure of Fatalisha seated on a throne and flanked by 2 family members. Here, in this particular carving, he is proclaiming power. He reaffirms his line of succession to his son, Abbas Mirza, and his grandson, Muhammad Mirza. So why did Fatalisha took over these images and techniques of the past? Well, I think the reason is because he was firsthand acquainted with them. You see, he was a prince governor of the province of Fars in between 1794 and 1797, when he was just 22 years old. He must have known these places like Persepolis, Bishapur, Naksh-e-Rustam, that were located in Fars during this time. And in the image, you can see that he actually took over one of the niches where the Sasanians rock carvings were found, and he just embedded himself on the wall. Another thing that we can observe in these rock carvings is the type of poetry that appears in them. The type of poetry has been identified as forming part of a movement known as the Bazgasht, or the return movement. It was a movement that aimed to resurrect the great Persian classical tradition of the Golden Age. It probably appeared in the late 18th century during the Safavid era as a reaction to the Indian-style poetry that was introduced in Iran after the expansion of the Mughal Empire. Fath Ali Shah was a poet himself, and he supported an active literary entourage in his court. And I believe that the purpose of the Bazgasht, which might have also been highlighted during his early rule in Shiraz, which was the capital of the province of Fars at the time, was the purpose of such tradition was to consolidate the rule of for poets to consolidate the rule of their patron, in this case, the king. And I want to quote the words of J.P. Luft on an article that he wrote that was written in 2001. With a romanticized notion of ancient Iran, it appeared the Qajar were creating a fairy tale of their own, removed from reality by championing scripture that was dissociated from their time and the misery of their subjects. And I think this is one of the reasons I chose the title of this talk, From Fairy Tales to Sovereigns, because it also reminds us the disconnection in between population and ruler in some occasions. This was the interesting document in the past appears as early in the 19th century during the rule of Fath Ali Shah, is evidenced in, for example, the documentation of Sir Robert Kerr Porter, a Scottish diplomat, that recalls that in a visit to Shiraz in 1818, Persian artists show him a very old drawing of a bas-relief. And on the screen, I want to share with you a very interesting document. This was written by the French tutor to a Qajar prince in Tabriz, called Louise de la Marinière. She undertook a journey through Fars in the 1830s, accompanied by a scribe, an artist, and a donkey, and she visited the ancient Achaemenid sites of Persepolis. What's interesting about this is that by early 19th century, many European travelers were coming to Iran to document the past, but were only reporting back to Europe. This is one of the first times in which we see that a document of such type is being produced for an Iranian audience. This manuscript was illustrated and was handed to Muhammad Shah Qajar on the screen on the left, who was the son of Fath Ali Shah, and was given to him in 1838. He was, by the way, a former pupil of Louise de la Marinière. Now I want to finalize this period, the period of Fath Ali Shah, moving on to Muhammad Shah, but there was very little interest in the history of Iran. He was very busy in war and could not pay too much attention to internal affairs. That's why I'm going to directly jump to the second person we identified back in the early slides as the second impetus of revivalistic styles. The second wave of interest is manifested in this rock-cut relief. This is the 8th, because Fath Ali Shah actually carved 7 of them. This is the 8th one that was created for the inauguration of a road in the northern provinces of Mazandaran in Iran. Nasser ad-Din Shah was very passionate for archaeology, for history, for photography, and his passion is manifested in the creation of a new museum, the Shahanshahi. It was a great time during the Nasseri period, as we call the period of Nasser ad-Din Shah. It was a great time for stability, which brought the conditions for the examination of the past and ancient story. It also, this interest in the past was propelled by a key moment in his reign, which was the decipherment of the Darius inscription at Behistun. in the Kermanshah province. This is an inscription that dates back to the 6th century BC, and that was translated by Sir Henry Rawlinson in 1851. The other element that facilitated the study of the past was the excavation of Persepolis prompted by the governor of Fars in 1877 and 1878. On the screen, you can see the earliest photographs, album of photographs of Persepolis made by Luigi Pesce, who was a Neapolitan military advisor and accomplished amateur photographer. It's an album that he gifted to Rawlinson in 1860s. Nasser-ad-Din Shah always accompanied himself with a photographer, and he recorded and ordered the documentation of several Achaemenid and Sasanian sites. An important aspect is that he also ordered the excavation, the archaeological excavation, in 1859 of the Arsacid site of Khure. And bear with me with that name, this Arsacid site of Khure, because we'll touch upon it a little bit later. Further documentation of the past happened by accomplished polymaths like the figure of Forsat al-Dawla Shirazi. He published in between 81 and 95 a book called the Azare Ajam, or Works of Ajam, which was a travelogue, first-hand biographical document narrating elements of the elite of Fars. He also illustrated several of the Achaemenid and Persepolitan reliefs, but with a Qajar style, as you can see on the screen. This is one of the pages of his publication, the Azare Ajam. What's important is that several other artists were also documenting Sasanian and Persepolitan sites. We already have seen this illustrate this rock-cut carving, that one of the victory of King Shapur over Emperor Valerian. And I just want to show you another one, an investiture scene that was accomplished, an illustration was done, a drawing was done by a Shirazi artist called Lutf Ali Suratgar. What's important about this documentation is that it allowed artists to have references. They were the first prototypes, along with photographs, for artists to develop a new visual culture. And suddenly, during the late 19th century, we begin to see houses, particularly and palaces in the region of Shiraz, to start using different types of media to represent these historicizing scenes of the Achaemenids and the Sasanians. And here you can see again this investiture scene that it's all over Shiraz. You can find also glazed tiles, alabaster pieces, and it's not only in Shiraz that this appears, because the Naseri period also left us pieces like this in Tehran, in the Palace of Golestan, where the artist was, you can see, was combining elements of Persepolitan art here and Sasanian art on the right. They managed to do it in a rather accomplished way, I believe. The arts of the period also can be compared to those of the Shahnameh, because you see here the name of Bahman. It's actually a copy of a rock carving of Shapur II. So still in the minds of Iranian audience, these figures represent their historical or mythical foundational or founders of their society. The artists at the time were also creating carvings, is attested by example for this, and also fakes and forgeries, because this particular head was attempting to represent an Achaemenid relief. The comparison now shows you what it is about. It's not an original one. The one on in the center on the left dates probably back to 1860s, and it was sold in Cairo, was sent at some point to Cairo and was sold to the Potter collection, and it's now in the Brooklyn Museum. These types of Qajar, late Qajar carvings decorated the basement of several Shirazi houses, like these ones. I'm sorry, Actually, I do have an image of them on my next slide. Here you can see also in the tympanum of this house and on the running frieze, these Assyrian elements, and the way suddenly this revival of ancient motifs is starting to be in vogue. This is actually the alabaster carving that I wanted to show you, which again evidences that these photographs were being of certain importance for the artist to have references. The Naseri period overall was a great moment for the study of Iranica. There was lots of interest from Europe at the time. The brother of Henry Rawlinson, who translated or deciphered the Darius inscription, George, carried studies on the Achaemenids in 1863, and it was through the circulation of these European works that Iranians began to know their past. However, these European works were translated into Persian, and they were translated by particularly two figures, Forsat al-Dawla Shirazi, who we have addressed previously by the creation of that travelogue of Fars with illustrations of the region and the Achaemenid sites, and the other was Etemat al-Sultaneh. Here on the image, he is photographed with Nasser ad-Din Shah. What's interesting or what's noteworthy is that Etemat al-Sultaneh was the person who organized the study of the site of Khorram, which I mentioned earlier on, prompted by Nasser ad-Din Shah. And one wonders, why did Nasser ad-Din Shah ordered the excavations at Khorram? Well, it appears al-Sultaneh was the person who identified the site as Arsacid, that is Parthian, the dynasty that stood in between the Achaemenids and the Sasanians. You see, it appears Nasser ad-Din Shah was not very fond of his Turkic origin or ancestry, that of the Qajar. And it might have been Etemat al-Sultaneh who had suggested to the king of kings, that the Qajar were actually of Arsacid lineage, or Parthians. Thus, the Qajar king Nasser ad-Din Shah happily ordered the further composition of a history of the Arsacids to Etemat al-Sultaneh. And I think what this does to us, what this interesting phenomenon does, is to demonstrate that identity is something extremely important for any nation, for their rulers and for their subjects. And that it's somehow the glue that gives meaning to any codependent union. And more importantly, it's something that we can create and we can control. I also want to compare this image with another one. I mean, the one on the left is Khor, and the one on the right is Persepolis. There is no reason why someone would organize the excavations of the first one. Technically, we're now at the end of the presentation, but I actually want to go a step further and discuss or reflect upon what all these artistic, stylistic movements represent and meant. What happens is that with intellectual inquiry and artistic inquiry of this type, new political and new intellectual views appear. And two particular figures during the late 19th century appeared who defended the glorification of ancient Iran. This was Mirza Fath Ali Yakundazadeh and Mirza Agha Khan Kermani. Both of them propelled an anti-Islamic feeling across the nation by linking themselves to be heirs of this ancient civilization. And you see, this was the time of the establishment of the Indo-European theory in Europe, particularly in England. In the very late 18th century, early 19th century, for example, Sir William Jones was arguing that the Indo-European theory, what establishes that several languages, for example, Spanish, English, Italian, Sanskrit, and Persian had similar roots, had common roots. And what that meant is that it must have originated from a common ancestor, common people. And at that time, they elaborated Indo-European as a language, but also as an ethnicity. And it was a time in which the concept of Aryan and Aryanism appeared. And Kermani was the first one to retrieve this idea of the Aryan race from these European texts that were in vogue and the European ideology in vogue at the time. So in general, there was an anti-Arab spirit that tried to differentiate themselves from Arabs by associating themselves to their Aryan lineage. It was Akundazadeh who corresponded with a prince called Jalaluddin Mirza, a Qajar prince, who admired the work of Jalaluddin Mirza, which was an epic publication named the Nameye Khosrowan, or the Book of Sovereigns. This publication stressed the cultural and political continuity from pre-Islamic period of up to the Qajar in a romanticized way. And also what's interesting is that they did not use any Arabic loanword. The late Qajar rulers lost a lot of imperial vision because of the decline of their power. It was the time in which the creation of a new parliament appeared. And at some point, the late Ahmad Shah Qajar was sent into exile, and the new dynasty, the Pahlavi, took over in the figure of Reza Shah Pahlavi. What the early Pahlavis did was mimic the ancient customs in a fashion similar to those of the Qajar, and created an image of their own nation for foreign regimes to identify. This interest in antiquities became known as the Bastangarai, the ancientism, looking back at ancient figures of art to imbue themselves. And on the screen, you can see what has been identified and termed as Neo-Achaemenid art, particularly fostered by the Pahlavis. This style manifested in particular in Neo-Achaemenid in architecture, in Tehran, in Shiraz, in the province of Fars, but also in London, in Paris, and in Bombay. A scholar, Tallinn Grieber, in fact, proposes that such program had the purpose of strengthening the domestic legitimacy of Persian kingship and establishing an element of continuity. The other thing is that it was meant to resist Western influence on Iran, or colonialism, what we call. Yet I think there is an element here that I must probably disagree slightly, because many of these buildings were made by Western architects. And what I think the Pahlavis were doing is actually to elevate themselves to the same position of the European powers of the time and say, you have your Greek and Roman temples and your neoclassical architecture. This is ours and this is what we have. And I want to show you just a couple of more images of this beautiful architecture that just, rather, the Qajar started to play with the forms and shapes of the pre-Islamic dynasties. The Pahlavis were almost copies. This continued to the subsequent, successor of Reza Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who continued and enhanced the adoption of elements of the past in an incredible marketing campaign, I would say. Empress Shahanu Pahlavi is here shown with a fashion that she adopted herself with very ethnic elements of the Iranian tradition. And in fact, the ideology of the Pahlavis was disseminated through mass schooling, propaganda, and the state's symbolic repertoire. And if you pay attention, you can see that the thrones in which, on the image on the right, Faradiba and Prince Reza are seated are a direct copy of an Achaemenid throne carved in Persepolis. Attention to symbolism and nuances of the persona of the late Shah and his courts are also evidenced in little details. if we have a look at the tie he's wearing, that tie is actually the Derafsh Kevani, the legendary royal standards of the Sasanians. And now, finally, we get to 1971, because we're running out of time, which marked the 2,500 years of the Persian Empire. This was accompanied by the most extravagant showcase of cultural revival that ever happened. It was a propagandistic shout out to the last emperor of, by the last emperor of Iran, to re-enliven the utopic view of Iran's great civilization. Many say that this event set the discontent amongst the least favored in society and the religious elites, leading to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. However, that should remain as content for another talk. And as a closure for today, I think what is important is a reflection on the significance of symbols to communicate ideas of identity and continuity, but more relevant is perhaps to think of the inherent power we have to gather as communities that are represented under an umbrella of symbols. And when the balance in between the symbols that represent the different people that form a community is broken, the unity of a society is at stake. In this case, we have seen that what started as a political tool to secure stability and in power of various families ended up leading to a major cultural response or backlash that would shake the foundation of a nation 200 years later. So that's all for today. Thank you very much for listening to this talk. And I just want to highlight that if you want to get more information about this topic, you should check the publications by Leila Diva, Judith Lerner, Lindsay Allen, Tallinn Grigor, and Susan Marai. And that's all for me now. Thank you so much.
Juan, for your comprehensive lecture. You touched upon many topics. I'm sure that the audience will probably have some questions. If I can ask you to either raise your hands, and then my colleague Ismail will probably unmute you, or you can ask in the chat by typing your question. I had a question for you to start with, Juan.
Go ahead.
I was very interested about, this, the topic of, the Qajars trying to reclaim this, a pre-Islamic past, because obviously as the rulers of Persia, it will make sense. And there's a lot of that in the Islamic world. You find similarities with things happening in India or in Egypt, for example. At the end of the Mamluk era, they forged some sort of genealogy saying that the Mamluks were a lost Arab tribe and they descended from Prophet Muhammad. So there's a lot of similarities. But I was also very interested in the fact that Nasruddin Shah ordered those excavations at the sites. So was that almost like a one-off, or was it like a concerted program? And if so, do we have any actual study of the appreciation of Iranian antiquities during the Qajar period?
Yes, so basically the sites during the Naseri period, several excavations took place, including some at Persepolis. But one of the most interesting ones for me was actually the one of the site of Hure, because it was very well documented, was one of the first excavations ever to be photographed, and obviously was accompanied by the publication of a series of stories of the Arsacid dynasties. The second part of your question, I think, is about any documentation of Iran. I mean, of the past, yes, I think the Asariya Jam somehow by Farsad al-Dawla Shirazi includes narratives of these ancient sites. But you actually pick me up on whether there is a whole compendium of studies of the Achaemenids and the Sasanians occurring at this time. I think it was mostly done by Europeans and translated by Etemat al-Sultaneh and by Farsad al-Dawla.
So during the, in terms of like the indigenous population, it was mainly during Nasruddin Shah's period. Was it? Yeah.
Yes, it was mainly during Nasser ad-Din Shah period. I think during the reign of Ali Shah, it was still too early for them to be preoccupied with this. And the earliest document or documentation in person for a Persian audience that I am aware of is actually the document by Louise de la Marinière, who went directly to these sites and recorded and illustrated them. That's as much as I know. I don't know whether during the Safavids anything was published at all, and I would doubt it.
Okay, thank you so much. Have we got any other questions? If yes, please raise your hand in the chat, or you can even type your question. I'll just wait for a couple of minutes if there is no.
I'm sorry, this is Susan Babe. Hi, Juan.
Hi,
when
Susan.
I tried to send you a chat, it wouldn't accept my chat to the center. It wasn't going to you in a personal way. I'm sorry. May I?
Yeah, please go ahead, because I haven't actually not seen any message from you yet.
Yeah. Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Juan, for really a fascinating talk. For the most part, I tend to agree with you on the level of the Qajar fascination with and deployment of the antiquities as a way of positioning themselves in a historical context. I think, however, that the period between the Arab-Muslim arrival, the collapse of the Sasanians, and the time of the rise of the Qajars is too long, too complex a history of negotiations with that past to be collapsed into one sweeping statement, which is not, I'm not saying you do it, but it's common amongst especially enthusiastic Qajar historians to make that leap, that there are multiple occasions and not just disparate ones, but interrelated, connected attempts at the preservation, revival, acknowledgement of those pre-Islamic pasts of Iran with references to the Sasanians, to the Parthians, to the Achaemenids, is really a very dense and complex fabric of memory and its representations. And I think that really is an important part of the story of how the Qajars or the Pahlavis come to adopt and negotiate these images and references. So I tend to think that neither Europeans were really the ones who saved it for Iranians, nor Qajars are alone in doing so. That in each stage of the adaptations and adoptions, one has a sense of that idea of Iran or Iran Shah to continue to survive in some form or fashion, even if it is garbed in an Islamic narrative. There's nothing wrong with that either, by the way, in my view. But thank you. And if you have some thoughts on that, I would be delighted to hear those.
No, thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate your observation here. And I think exactly what usually tends to happen in academia is that anything that happened before the Qajar that makes reference to pre-Islamic Iran is usually put under the umbrella of the Shahnameh. So everyone would usually refer to the Shahnameh, and that's how they had notions of ancient Iran. But as you say, the negotiations in between that ancient historical past, the mythical past documented in the Shahnameh, and the archaeological evidence is much more complex. In my particular case, I'm not an expert on that transition from early medieval dynasties up to the Qajar. And what I found fascinating, and I think it's at the core of this discussion, it's how the Qajar, I feel, really visually, in a very visual manner, took over these elements and imbue themselves into them. They said, I'm going to take the Kayanian crown from here. I'm going to take my garb, my garments, my customs, to be echo that continuity that could be. I mean, the way it has been addressed is that it's almost indirect. And I wonder, and I hope one day someone can do a study of how direct actually that was, because when you compare and contrast several points of the Qajar and their historical past, the similarities are far too common. So clearly, it would be, and I think, Susan, you actually have published a book on Iranian kingship with Talik Grigor, I think, that discusses precisely this whole narrative back from the ancient Iran up to the Pahlavis. So I think for our audience, it's actually a great book, a great reference to look into if you're interested in the topic.
I think, Ismail, you can see if there are any people raising their hands, because I can't see from my screen. So if there are, you can unmute them and they can ask the questions. We'll just wait for another couple of minutes, otherwise we're going to hand it to them. I think we had a very good discussion as well after the talk.
Yeah, go and ask me questions, please. Go and put me on the, the spotlight. Feel free, please. I think it's a very interesting topic, and sometimes overlooked by people.
So
yes,
yes.
I have a question, Sami.
Yeah.
And for Mr. Juan. So the Qajar are originally a Turkish tribe, but they also tried to legitimize themselves as Aryans, or wasn't this an issue with them?
Okay, this is a very complex question. They are not Turkish, they're Turkic, which is Turkish. The people from Turkey descend are, it's a very mixed ethnicity, descends from Turkic people, Turkic-speaking people. The origin of the Turkic people, it's also a complex one. It is said usually that it was on the steppes of Mongolia or southern Russia or towards the Caspian Sea. So it was, what's important about that element is that it was a nomadic tribe, a tent tribe that adopted a lifestyle, an urban setting in their living style. And they identify themselves as Aryans, and the word Aryan, it's really complex. What it basically meant at the time in the 19th century is an ethnic group, which now we know it's not correct, that originated more or less in the same area of the Turkic tribes, whose lineage took all over Europe, all over Iran, all over India. And you can see I'm talking with lots of care, because the Aryan question, it's a very complex one. And what they were trying is to identify themselves with this ethnicity, because their language was an evidence, a proof of that origin. And for them, I believe, I'm not necessarily an expert on this Aryan dialogue. I think I wanted to discuss that as a consequence of the Qajar's decision to imbue themselves into this Achaemenid style or Sasanian revival style. What's interesting is that they were trying to push the limits, so to say, of their identity within the region and in the face of foreign and external powers, mostly Europe. So at the time where Europe, France, England, Russia is trying to colonize several regions, themselves to align in a way with the Europeans, as we share a similar origin, might have helped in the process of achieving such an objective. So that's as much as I want or I can say about this, because otherwise I get into a territory that I'm not the best expert to discuss such a thing.
Thank you so much, Juan. Again, very exhaustive type of answer. I think we're going to leave it at that, but it was great. And thank you so much again. Thank you for the talk, and thank you, the audience. And we shall see you soon with the next lecture. You're going to get details quite soon about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sami, and thank you so much to everybody for your questions and your attention. Take care.
Take care, bye.